I'd like to begin my talk with some quotes we've seen in the media lately. January 22nd, it's going to be just fine. February 23rd, we're very, very cognizant of everything going on. We have it very much under control in this country. March 12th, it's a foreign problem. We have all witnessed how in a matter of weeks, something that felt like a remote problem, something that would not impact us here in the United States, something that, quite frankly, other people had to deal with, is now causing massive illness and death here at home, ravaging our communities, our economy, and our daily lives. I'm talking about the coronavirus, of course, but these very same statements are often applied to the issue being addressed by this TEDx event, climate change. Whether we acknowledge it or not, climate change is here. And just as we were caught off guard by the coronavirus's impacts across the world, we must prepare now for the humanitarian crisis that climate change will bring. We know the world is getting hotter. July was the hottest month on record for the planet and continues the trend of the last 5 years, ranking as the 5 hottest. It was so hot last summer that 12.5 billion tons of ice melted away from the Greenland ice sheet. That wasn't supposed to happen for another 50 years. When ice sheets melt, the sea level rises and coastal communities are forever submerged. If we look just 30 years out into the future, to 2050, research shows that sea level rise could cause southern Vietnam to all but disappear. Large parts of Shanghai, Mumbai, Bangkok, and Alexandria, Egypt are all projected to be underwater by 2050. Maybe we think that's only a foreign problem. Let's look at some projections a little closer to home. The interactive NASA maps shown here demonstrate the effect of sea level rise on coastal areas of the United States, and the areas that would be covered in water are shaded red. So you see here with 1 meter of sea level rise, which is about 3 feet, that it may not look like a ton of land, but a lot of these areas are very densely populated. If we look at the next map with 2 meters of sea level rise, about 7 feet, with just this additional meter of sea level rise, we see that the Florida Keys are completely submerged, as is Miami Beach, and New Orleans is nearly completely lost to water. You may be wondering, when will this rise in sea level actually occur? Well, studies differ as to timing and severity, but there is complete agreement that the seas are rising at an alarming rate. A recent meta-analysis by the Academy of Science indicates that a 6-foot rise by the end of the century is generally agreed upon by climate scientists. That means that by 2100, 13 million people in the US alone could be forced to relocate due to rising sea levels. To put that number in perspective, Hurricane Katrina flooded 80% of New Orleans and displaced nearly 1 million people in the Gulf Coast region. When projections take into account population density, even a small amount of flooding displaces a lot of people. What will become of the people who live in these flooded cities? We know exactly what will happen because we already know how displacement affects communities. People will lose their homes, their livelihood, and in many places, their cultural continuity. As we have seen from previous migratory-related events, they will move to cities which must be prepared to absorb a sudden influx of people. There will be serious implications for food security, increased pressure on infrastructure networks such as transportation and housing, and more competition for jobs. On a global scale, we must anticipate a transnational dislocation the likes of which we have never seen before. 3 years ago, I spoke on what Americans could do about the 5 million Syrian refugees fleeing their war-torn country. With the climate crisis, we are looking at 140 million displaced people, a scale almost 28 times that of Syria. And we remember how most of the world reacted to Syria by passing extremely restrictive immigration laws and closing our borders. Climate change will exacerbate the severe inequality that already exists within our world. As we currently see from populations displaced due to war, a whole generation could grow up in shelters or refugee camps, where attempts at education are sporadic, where people are hungry and diseased, and where vulnerable groups are often taken advantage of and abused. How will the world respond? How will we respond, as a nation and as individuals? In order to plan a productive response to this crisis, we must have a change in mindset, meaning we must frame the issue properly. A new term has been coined to capture these populations of people displaced by extreme weather events: climate migrants. But if we call the displaced person a climate migrant, do we have any responsibility to them? In our current political climate, any talk of people immigrating into our country is extremely polarizing. We could call them climate refugees, knowing that a refugee's designation comes with certain obligations by the host country. And there are organizations currently working on such designations. But we must remember that in the coming decades, there will not be a single person who is not personally affected by the Earth's rising temperatures and seas. A climate refugee may be your neighbor down the street whose house unexpectedly and suddenly flooded. We need to remember that regardless of what we ultimately call the displaced person, regardless of where they're from, whether a foreign country or the next town over, he or she is a human in need of food, shelter, and an opportunity to contribute. Now next, we need to accept responsibility for the mess we created. The US, as the world's second biggest emitter of greenhouse gases, needs to be a leader. We must recommit to international agreements such as the Paris Climate Accords that limit carbon dioxide emissions and provide transparency in reaching climate change goals. Further, every nation must develop policies that support renewable energy initiatives, such as solar, wind, and tidal energy, because these have the direct effect of reducing carbon emissions. And we need to be stringent in the regulation and enforcement of these policies. Beyond accepting responsibility for the problem, we need to contribute to the solution. Climate change is going to intensify the severe inequality that already exists between countries. The poorer countries of Southeast Asia are responsible for less than 1% of global carbon emissions, but they are going to be hit the hardest and the soonest by rising sea levels. We need to provide support to these countries, like Vietnam and Bangladesh, who are going to have millions of displaced people within their borders by 2050. We need to provide resources and funds so that these countries can prepare to absorb their internally displaced citizens. And what about our ability to absorb the displaced? In addition to the 13 million people within the US who will lose their homes due to sea level rise, we must be prepared to receive international climate migrants. It's our pollution that caused their homes to flood and their water sources to dry up. This means developing migrant-friendly policies that are realistic and humane. On a practical level, we must develop ways to safely and effectively assimilate newly relocated populations. This means improving infrastructure such as transportation and housing, improving our social services and our employment opportunities. We need to think creatively, asking where we can increase population density and develop new agricultural methods so that we can increase crop yields to help feed this influx of people. We need to call on urban planners, policymakers, social workers, engineers, and everyone in between to begin this work. Now finally, there's something all of us can do to ensure that these steps happen. We can vote. You have the opportunity to directly influence how our country responds to this impending crisis. So take it. We currently have elected officials who deny that climate change exists, who remove inconvenient facts from government publications, and to respond to current health crises with unrealistic statements that the problem, like a miracle, will just disappear. We must replace them with leaders and policymakers who are informed about the crisis and who can help to plan and prepare for the inevitable human migrations that will take place. Those we elect must be informed, they must be forward-thinking, and they must have a global perspective on the problem. We need to think about these things when we go to the polls. It's time to put climate change on the front burner. Now, as a 17-year-old, I have my whole life ahead of me. I want to continue to be able to climb mountains, swim in the ocean, jump into cold, clear lakes. I've been lucky enough to see and hike on glaciers, and those incredible experiences have helped shape me. To think that glaciers could be all but gone in a few decades, but more that their melted ice be responsible for uprooting millions of people, breaks my heart. But if we act now, we can change that future. We can change how those maps I showed you earlier will look. Let's fight to make sure our planet, the planet our children inherit, maintains its beauty, continues to fuel our spirit of discovery and continues to offer us life and a home. Climate change is a humanitarian issue, and it demands a humane response by us. Thank you.